I sat with the senior mullah in Iraqi Kurdistan, and he said, I am Kurdish first and Muslim second. We will not allow the Arabization here. We will not allow the radicalization. We will walk with our Western friends. We will be moderate.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext. And before we go to our program today, would you do us an enormous favor? If you're watching on YouTube and you haven't yet subscribed, there's a little bell down there. If you just click that subscribe, it won't be annoying. It won't be a problem. It won't cost you anything, but it really helps us in the search engine process when people are looking for these kinds of programs. If you're not watching on the YouTube channel, check it out sometime. And again, if you hit that subscribe button, it really helps us. If you're still a podcast user primarily, whether it's iTunes or any podcast aggregate where you get your podcast from, again, give us a nice rating there. It really helps for others to find us. Doesn't cost you a thing. We continue to have a ministry approach to this. We don't charge for anything, and it just helps in how people find Michael Easley inContext or Ask Dr. E. Now, with all that aside, welcome to the broadcast. It's a great privilege to have Stephen Mansfield today on the program. Stephen is a former pastor. He's a consultant to a lot of people in, let's just say, high places. He works a lot helping individuals develop their speaking ability, working through trauma, working through problems. And he's also an extraordinary author. He's written many books. The Faith of George Bush, The Faith of Barack Obama. If those don't make you scratch your head, you're not paying attention. He's written a great book on Oprah Winfrey, a phenomenal book on Winston Churchill, a book called Manly Men, and he's got a whole effort helping young men understand what it means to be a good, godly man. And his most recent work is a book called The Miracle of the Kurds. And this is a subject we're going to touch on in a few minutes, but welcome to the broadcast, Stephen.
Michael, it's always great to be with you on the air or off, my friend.
So before we get into other topics, Stephen, talk a little bit about the Kurds, because a lot of folks don't know the story and how important this people group is.
Yeah, the Kurds are an amazing people. They are, for Bible readers, the ancient Medes. Even their national anthem claims that they are the ancient Medes. Their European television show is Mede TV. They began pouring into Nashville back in the 90s when Saddam was persecuting them in Iraq. There had already been some Kurdish families here, and them being very tribal and familial, they began to pour into Nashville. And they began to beg me and some others to go help with their kinsmen in Iraq. So we formed an NGO, started going into Iraq, we did everything from backpack computers over the mountains to them, to build houses, to advocate with the Vatican, Congress, etc. And it was really something. And so the Kurds are some of the best friends America's ever had. Very loyal to us, very devoted. They are a 95% Muslim people, and yet many Kurds will turn to Jerusalem to pray every day. Many Kurds are Jewish, in fact, especially there's a whole Kurdish Jewish section in Jerusalem. So they're an unusual people, but they are pro-democratic, pro-American, pro-West, Christian tolerant. In the KRG, the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, there's actually a Christian department, which welcomes me every time I show up. So they're very unusual people, and they are some of our best allies. And we have not, by the way, always treated them well.
Now, like the Druze in Israel will also serve in the IDF, will the Kurds?
Some of the Kurds will serve in the IDF. Yeah, you can be sure there are Kurds in the IDF right now. And by the way, Kurdish Peshmerga, they call them in Kurmanji, that means those who face death, have fought alongside U.S. troops. I have many friends, as you know, you and I both do, special forces in U.S. military, and they'll just get teared up talking about how the Kurdish Peshmerga fought at their side and died for them. So these are people we owe. These are people who have served us well. And yes, there are definitely Kurdish troops in the IDF right now.
And that's been probably the one reputation thing I have heard about them is they're some of the best fighters on the planet.
Michael, they were the bodyguards for the czars. They're trained in the mountains in unusual ways. Even a young girl will be taught to shoot on one foot, then shoot on the other, then shoot hanging from a tree. They're fierce fighters and really, really good. And for some parts of their history, they've been brigands up in the mountains, the Zagros Mountains. But as they've grown and emerged, they've become amazing allies to the U.S. By the way, the Kurds are 35 million people worldwide, and they're the largest people group without their own homeland. So we're all hoping for that to happen, maybe even in our lifetimes. We'll see. It's not likely, given given where they're located. They'd have to carve pieces of Syria and Turkey and Iran and Iraq. It's not likely to happen, at least where they're dreaming of it. But it's a dream we all hope for because they deserve it.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about Israel. You and I have a love for the land, and I know you've been there many, many times, as have I. But I've not seen the division and the vitriol in since October 7th, what's happened in our country, and we can talk about some of the roots of that. But I'm interested to get your perspective, first of all, on Israel. Again, maybe 4 or 5 bullet points of how we got to where we are right now after October 7th.
Well, it's interesting in terms of the Western response, which is what intrigues me the most at the moment. There's just been a long history in our universities of teaching neo-Marxism. And neo-Marxism assumes that if there are 4 of us in the room, one has to be the oppressor. And so Israel is taught at our universities as an oppressor. And that's why I know many of the kind of people you and I hang with are shocked that there would be the kind of pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic riots and demonstrations at Harvard, at Yale, at Columbia, at University of Chicago. But this is neo-Marxism that's being taught. And of course, I'll just say real quickly, a little bit of one of my main themes is make sure you know what's being taught at the universities you support and where you send your children. However, what happened on October the 7th was a scripted thing. This was not just a blow up by Hamas. This had been scripted by Iran. Of course, Hamas is nothing but a terrorist organization sponsored by Iran. And this was at a time when Israel was distracted, as you know well, because you watch these trends. There had been a fight going on and many demonstrations about Netanyahu attempting to restructure the Supreme Court and the judiciary of Israel. This had been a distraction. Hamas knew it was a distraction. And so they decided to violate a peace treaty, by the way. They were under a peace agreement at the time, and kill 1,400 Jews in horrible ways, just horrible ways. I have friends in some kibbutzes. I don't mean to be too graphic on your show, but babies were literally thrown into ovens. And so vile, terrible. And now, of course, the West immediately goes into, well, let's have peace, let's reconcile, let's have an accord, which of course never really moves the ball very far down the field, and usually just makes Western voters feel better about their elected leaders. But this is a desperate situation, and the big solution that the West is proposing, a 2-state solution, the Arab leaders have rejected time after time after time. So it was violent, it was bloody, it was ugly. It's not that big a surprise, frankly, for those of us who, like you, who watch these trends there. And it was scripted. That's why that happened so quickly on university campuses around the world. That's why Hamas vacated Gaza so quickly, knowing the Israelis would move in, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a desperate situation, but the good news for those of us who care about Israel is that there was Hamas tipped its hand, Iran tipped its hand, Hezbollah tipped its hand, the Houthis tipped their hand. In other words, now more people in the West know who we're dealing with and how they're in league with each other and how dastardly many of them really are.
How do we help the young mind in America understand a little bit more history? Because let's say these universities, whether it's DEI or some iteration of indoctrination, as opposed to when you and I were in school, it was critical thinking. It was, here are the 2 sides, and you've got to hammer out why you believe what you believe. You've got to defend it. You've got to marshal forth the evidence. I remember in a debate course being assigned pro-life and pro-abortion at random. And you had to debate, according to rules of debate, which, that side, and it wasn't whether you agree with it or not, is could you marshal the evidence? And I just called it critical thinking or critical worldview. And now it's overused, but indoctrination. How did this happen?
Well, it happened, frankly, and I don't mean to continue to blame the universities. As you know, I have a role at an American university and believe in higher education like you do. We've both given our lives in part to it. But the fact is that there's very poor education in the field of history, first of all, second of all, in the field of international relations, and certainly about Israel. And so one of the Israeli reporters who actually works for an American outlet that I really admire is a former beauty queen. You may have seen her on YouTube. She goes around asking American students about what they're chanting. So from the river to the sea, she'll take that phrase and she'll go ask demonstrators what they mean. It proves they don't know. It's a phrase that's been handed to them by protesters. Sometimes they read it off a sheet or a poster. Sometimes their university professors have given it to them. They don't even know where these rivers are. They don't know what it means. This person will also go and describe atrocities or describe offers of agreements. Hey, by the way, which side do you think offered a two-state solution as recently as in the last 15 years? And they'll say, oh, absolutely Hamas, absolutely the Arabs. No, it was Israel. So this is an example of what's going on at the university level. And I think that you ask how we can help. I think we really need to dive in with books, with the arts, with seminars, with helpful engagement. You know, you and I are Christians, and so we don't believe that we should just join an extreme view of something. My Christianity moves me a bit more moderate, considering both sides, considering both arguments, considering the humanity on both sides. I have Christian Arab friends in Gaza, and I grieve for what they're enduring. And we have disagreements. We talk. They're upset with Israel, obviously, but they do understand that they're being held captive by Hamas. That's something the average American university student does not understand. So we have a huge educational task, and most of even politically conservative pro-Israel America does not understand what the young are being taught as early as high school and why, therefore, they're so easily radicalized.
Well, just to be, point blank, how do you keep hope? I mean, you know me pretty well, and I'm kind of a Eeyore half glass guy. We're a 248-year-old experiment, and it seems ostensibly, I don't know how we get out of the ditch we're in our own homeland, much less how we educate 20-somethings and younger who have just heard these spiels. I was talking to another friend about social media, and you've got this instantaneous disinformation that can't be corralled, and maybe it shouldn't be, I don't know, but they don't get news the way we consume news. They get TikTok, they get something very brief and short and kitschy, and they believe it. And it almost seems like we don't even have any water for the squirt gun that the forest fire we're facing.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit more optimistic, maybe, Michael. You and I share the same worldview, but I'm a little bit more optimistic. And that is that I believe, look, fact is that I can hang up from being interviewed by you today and enjoying our time on the air and take my iPhone and produce a video that millions can see sitting right here in my office. That's brand new. So you're right. I watch my children. I watch the university students I hang with. They are getting their education from YouTube, from TikTok. But that's a forum we can get into. We don't have to start at Harvard to change a generation. We can do really good video. Prager University is doing this. Other people are doing this. I have had a minor role in advising some aspects of the Israeli government, and I've said, look, you've got to do a full court press, man. You've got to teach people. You've got to train them, because the sympathy factor, which is a lot of where our very emotional college students are persuaded, a lot of the way they're persuaded, the sympathy factor is with the Palestinians. But the average college student doesn't even know what a Palestinian is, for heaven's sake. So we can educate them. We can win this thing. We can win hearts and minds. I'm not sure, frankly, we've shown up for the battle. And even among my Christian friends who are radically pro-Israel, and I'll use the technical term that you can define later, premillennial on these issues, they've got to be careful that they don't just sound like, all Arabs are meant to be fodder for Israeli tanks. I mean, we don't believe that. I believe, as you do in the Augustinian just war theory, you have to maintain proportionality. You have to have just reasons for going into war. None of that I'm saying is anti-Israel. I'm just saying that sometimes we've got pretty famous television preachers, and they just sound like they hate the Arabs. Well, well, the Arabs were there on the day of Pentecost. God's got a will for them. God's reaching to them. A lot of them are Christians. We need to be a bit more measured and careful in how we as Christians present our eschatology or our views as well. So I think we can turn this thing. I really do. And frankly, I don't want to be applauding the spilling of Israeli blood or certainly Gazan and Arab blood, but the good side, the silver lining of the situation is that a lot of people are paying attention. They're realizing what they've been told is not true. And if we don't just turn Gaza into a parking lot, shedding even more blood, I think there's a hearing, an openness right now that hasn't been there in many decades.
Now, taking Israel's view, and Israel, of course, today is not, you know, I love Israel. I've been there many, many times. I've
Me
encouraged
too.
people, you need to go before your life's over. If you read the Bible, you're getting a black and white view of great information, the very word of God. But when you see the land, it becomes holographic in ways. It
No
just
question.
expands. When you sit at the Sea of Galilee, when you go to the Jordan River, you go, that's a creek, not a river. When you see this, what is it? 3% of the land mass of the Middle East is this little sliver about the size of Connecticut called Israel. And, when people see that over against this enormous Middle Eastern piece of real estate, why are they all fighting over this? How can you have two states there? And again, you can't explain that from a pulpit just with words. You can do okay, but you know what I'm saying? When you and I go to Gaza or the West Bank and you see the no-go zones, essentially the A areas where the Jews can't go, but Palestinian workers could come in and work. Same with Jordan, they could come in and work in Israel. And I've tried to compare it to Mexico. That a lot of migrant workers would come up during harvest times, during work and farming times, and there was sort of this, okay, it's not perfect, but we allow it because they can make more money in the States than they can make in their homeland. And that was ostensibly the same with Palestine, with Gaza, with the West Bank. That said, it's really hard to have, quote, compassion when a Palestinian neighborhood has munition caches in a school or a women's clinic or rocket launchers by an elementary school or a daycare center. So you see where this far right, firebrand preachers on TV go. So help me out there. I mean, here's a family that was, let's say they were born and raised in that context in Gaza or the West Bank. This is all they've ever known. They see the wealth and prosperity across the border, literally, and they feel impoverished because of Israel. And now they're in a fight for their lives. There's a lot of things going on here from a geopolitical, from a humane, much less a Christian point of view.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, let's just get perspective here for just a minute, as you've just done. The citizens of Israel are 8 million people. The citizens of the Arab nations throughout the Middle East are 430 million people. Israel's 200 miles north to south, 70 miles wide, sometimes as little as 7 miles wide. It's a sliver. And so clearly the opposition to Israel is not about landmass, it's about religion. It's about the fact we don't want a Jewish state. Well, that's happened. That's been established since 48. That's a legal act. By the way, the Israelis have done nothing but upgrade that land, which was largely empty as of the time the Jews began to move in, especially after World War II. So what we have to understand in the West is that even the Gazans understand that they are being held captive by Hamas. They did far better under Israel. They were governed by Israel until about 2007. The Intifada, everybody remembers the rock throwing and the fires. The Intifada forced Israel to make a decision to leave. They left. They took the Jewish population out for the most part. And within a very short period of time, you had an election in which a terrorist organization, Iranian-run terrorist organization, became the leading party and thus the government. So the Gazans that I talk to understand that they're under terrorist control. Understand that these people, I have friends who have been told by basically Gazan military, don't leave your apartment complex. We want you to be the human barrier against Israeli attacks. There are assassins, there are sharpshooters on the building across the street. We will shoot you if you leave your building. So here is Hamas sharpshooters keeping Gazans in their building so that the Israelis won't bomb. And yes, there are weapons caches underneath. There are military facilities, headquarters underneath schools and orphanages and old folks' homes and apartment complex. It's an evil organization run by a nation that is the largest purveyor of terrorism in the world, or Iran. And it's tragic. Thus, the opportunity, I think, for us to win hearts and minds, even in the middle of this horrible situation. The other problem, by the way, let me just say real quickly, is you well know that Hamas just absolutely lies about the death count, and yet that's what gets reported in the Western world. So right now we're believing that 30,000 people have been killed. I don't think that number is true. I think it's about half that size. Everyone a tragedy, don't misunderstand. But nevertheless, it's a tough, tough situation, and people are dying left and right. But we've got to wrench Gaza back out of the hands of Hamas.
Let me jump in there. So if you were born in that culture, let's say before Hamas is elected in ostensibly as a terroristic government, if you grew up there, teenager, went to school, you get married, you have kids, this is all you've known, Stephen. And you grow up around a munitions cache. You grow up around guys with not ARs, but what are they using? Kalashnikovs, whatever they're using. You see all this armament, all this gear, and all these young men are trained to kill, especially to hate. How do you tease that out for Arabs that happen to live there?
Well, let me give you something anecdotal that kind of represents my broader case. My barber in Washington, D.C. is Lebanese. He was military. He said what changed him was he would see on television the Israeli government offering to give up 200 prisoners for one dead Israeli soldier's body. Give it back to us, we'll give to him, because they valued life. And he said that's what turned me. He's now pro-Israel. He's now living he owns a network of barbershops in the D.C. area. And he brought tears to my eyes while I was getting my haircut because he said, I watched television and I realized that Hezbollah, that Houthis, that Hamas, they don't care about lives. They will sacrifice anybody's life, especially Arab street lives, anytime they can. But here were the Israelis, and the Israeli government were offering hundreds of prisoners now. These are criminals, people who will probably repeat offend, for one dead IDF soldier because they so valued life. And that turned him. So my point is that this is the kind of thing. I'm not saying we go all soft and preachy. I'm just saying we show compassion. We show that we're, for example, one of the things that most impacts the Arabs I talk to in the Middle East is that the Arabs who are actually Israeli citizens, and by the way, there's almost 2 million of them, the Arabs who are actually Israeli citizens are in some of the best shape of all Arabs in the whole Middle East. Of that 430 million I mentioned, if you live in Israel, you got the best services, the best care, the best support. Because so they know this, they're aware of this. Whereas compare that to Gaza, where it's just pretty much at least the conditions of an open air prison. So I hear you. It's a tough situation, but I don't think we've been showing up to fight these battles. And I'll tell you one other little thing, just to be really controversial here. I spend time with a lot of Christian Arab leaders, and they say we could do a lot of good if the American and Western Christians would just partner with us. But they'll fly all the way over here and go to Israel, and they won't come across to meet with us, for example, in Amman, Jordan. And so I think if we'll build better relationships, guys like you and me, with the Arab Christian leaders, we can do a lot of good and turn some of these things.
I've got a good friend, Ahmad Shahidi, who started the Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. And many years ago when I was over there, his story is amazing, how he was able to put an evangelical seminary in Jordan. It needs to be made into a book or in a film. But he was telling me, he said, you want to talk eschatology? You have Arab Christians, you have Coptic Christians, you have those from Jordan, you have all these different Middle Eastern, and you talk about whose land is it?
Yes, exactly.
He said it's quite exciting. Your theology is really put on trial. But let me change subjects. Let me go back to when we see in the media what Israel has done. It's remarkable in military description. I mean, what they've accomplished is incredible, and they seem to have a tenacity and a patience with, okay, we're done. We're done trying to have two states. We're done trying to keep peace. We're done dealing with the 800 to 1,000 rockets they launch in every year that's never reported. We're done with this nonsense once and for all. That said, what do you do with 2.3 million Palestinians now that have walked a one-lane path to the south? Egypt doesn't want them. Jordan doesn't want them. The Arab states don't want them.
Yeah, that's a serious crisis. But I would suggest that if the U.S. would get involved, would bring in other Western nations and figure out how to resettle those people, perhaps in some cases even in Israel. I know some folks are going to lose their minds over that, but if Israel would take some of them, I think it's very revealing that the Arab nations don't want them. I think it's interesting that Egypt basically has troops keeping these people out. Why don't you want these people? It
They're
reminds
fodder.
me.
They're cannon fodder.
Exactly, exactly. But how about we break them up and settle them in prosperity in a variety of nations around the world and remove this gripe against Israel? On the scale of human relief efforts around the world, we're only talking about 2 million people. Now, I know some folks just go, 2 million, that's a lot. It's not a lot in terms of the total scope and landmass of the Middle East. So why don't we resettle them in a humane way? Now, I'll tell you who will have to fight to do that. We'll have to fight Hamas because they want to keep them as hostages. They want to keep them as the human barriers against Israel. But we're going to have to get involved. I take seriously the concerns of the Palestinians. I take seriously their claim. I don't believe what some folks believe, which we already have a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. I don't think that works that way. But I think we can resettle these people and remove this issue. Gaza. This is going to sound. This is what people will write you about on your discussion board. Gaza doesn't have to exist. Gaza doesn't have to exist. The people can be cared for, and Gaza can return to being part of Israel or whatever, but it does not have to be the hellhole that it's been. And I think we can address that. And people in D.C. are starting to talk in those terms.
When one of the first times I went to Israel was mid-90s, I think. And when you're in the quarters, Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter, so forth, it doesn't take a second to realize, oh, I've left the Jerusalem quarter.
Yes.
And when you drive in neighborhoods, and we would take groups up to see a picture, a shot of the Judean wilderness and explain, okay, this isn't exactly where Jesus or John, lived, but this is a good depiction of what the Judean wilderness looks like. You go through a Jewish neighborhood, it's like a upper middle class American neighborhood, streets, playgrounds, parks, and bomb shelters. And you go up and you look at the Judean wilderness and you drive back through the neighborhood. Then you go to an Arab town. It's squalid.
Exactly.
There's trash in the streets. The buildings are in disrepair. People don't care. And that to me was one of the most, enlightening pictures of there's a different worldview. And to your point, before Israel reoccupied and took their land back, it was the same way. It was in disrepair, and water and orchards and citrus trees everywhere you go. Any little postage stamp, they've done something with it. If they haven't, they're working on it.
Exactly.
And you don't see this. You've traveled the Middle East. You don't see this now in Amman, in Jordan. Sure, you see an upper middle class with a lot of oil money, but that's a cultural picture that unless people go and put feet on the ground, they'll never understand, Stephen.
No, it's absolutely true. You couldn't be more correct. And this is something that those of us who have a little bit of a hearing with some Arab leaders try to stress, which is you've got a cultural issue more than you've got an Israel issue. It's convenient to blame every Arab discomfort and dysfunction on the Jews, but that is just not true. It's not even demographically possible. It's a cultural issue, and you're exactly right. Nothing shocks Western Christians more when they tour Israel as to walk from the Jewish quarter to the Arab quarter in Jerusalem and see the difference. Bloody animal carcasses in the street and trash and what have you. And they are clean people. Remember, these are people who wash themselves, at least the men, 5 times a day to do salat. Their homes are clean. They keep halal, which is the Arab version of kosher. But they don't have the same view about public space, and so that horribly misrepresents them. And I'm with you 100% on that. It's something they've got to change. But a lot of this is a culture. It's a way of thinking. As you've said, it's a generation. As you know, I'm close to the African American community, attend an African American church in D.C. and all that. And so we talk about what happens to a young African American man in the inner city whose family's on generation his whole life up to 18. And the stats are, and African American leaders are the ones who told me this, the stats are that young African American male is almost unemployable if he's been on welfare his entire life up to the age of 18 or 20. Well, some of I don't believe that he's unemployable. I believe it can be changed, but this is very much the way it is with Arab young men: angry, unfathered, disenfranchised, looking for a cause. I mean, let me tell, I won't go long, but let me tell very quickly. I knew a British journalist who was held by ISIS. When he escaped and got back to England, the young men in ISIS would write him as though they were old friends, telling him about their girlfriends, telling them about what they were doing, as though nothing weird had happened. And he came to the conclusion these are young, unfathered, untethered, angry men. And ISIS came along and gave them a fight, gave them an enemy, gave them an opportunity to take both women and wealth, gave them a band of brothers, so to speak, quoting Shakespeare. And that's why they rally to it. They're not really given to the distinctives of ISIS. Well, I think the same thing is going on with Hamas and the radicalization of the young in the Arab world. I think that these young men who roam the streets are given a cause, given a code, given a band of brothers, given a chance to enrich themselves a bit, and of course they're given an enemy in Israel and the great Satan, the United States. And that's a lot of what's going on. We change that culture, we can change the Middle East.
But then you're going back to, they have a theocratic view, and Islam is not just a religion; it's a government, and
Yes.
so it's akin to what I was asking about the Palestinian. If it's all you ever know, and if you break from that and go west or go to Europe, you're a 0.01 percenter, because the opportunities, unfortunate word, but the ability to get out of that system is impossible because they are impoverished. There is only one doctrine. How do you break? And this is why I think that Christians get sort of, they lump all Arabs together, because it looks like, how do you even dial the combination of that? I have a friend I was in seminary with, and he lives in a Muslim culture. He never disclosed where. I've been 43 years in ministry. He's been 43 years in a Muslim culture. And occasionally we would trade these cryptic emails. And I one time asked him why he stayed there, because he had no efficacy, none whatsoever. And he wrote a rather blistering letter to me, basically saying, because nobody else is over here doing it. And I applaud his courage and his faithfulness, but only eternity will show, did he have an impact? And you know as well as I do, if you come to Christ out of those contexts, your life's in danger immediately.
Yes. Well, I believe that we've got to take this on at a cultural level. I tell people in D.C., you've got to have more respect for what it means, exactly as you say, Michael. If your whole life you've been fed a certain diet, this is what you're going to believe intellectually. So don't import people. Don't allow immigration of these people without doing something to change the culture, without doing something to challenge these underlying assumptions. And also dance with those who agree with you. I mean, the Kurds are sitting there in the Middle East. Here they are, pro-Western. They are, I sat with the senior mullah in Iraqi Kurdistan, and he said, I am Kurdish first and Muslim second. We will not allow the Arabization here. We will not allow the radicalization. We will walk with our Western friends. We will be moderate. I mean, I hope you can go with me to Erbil and to the northern part of Iraq sometimes. I mean, it's unbelievable the progress they've made. And again, 95%, 96% Muslim people, but the culture within that Islam changed, largely because they became the victims of their Muslim brothers, and so they went more moderate. But they're a model for the Middle East, and we can do this. We can change this. We can turn from the radical hard edge. But we have to appreciate and understand exactly what you're saying, the distinctives of that angry culture. That's why, though I certainly believe, don't misunderstand, that Israel had the right to retaliate after October 7th, if now they go too far, if now they do not maintain what Augustine would have called proportionality in their response, will radicalize another generation where we can't. I really think they are winnable. I have, and I'm no great shakes, I have in an evening over tea and baklava largely turned a table of angry young men because they're hearing things they don't know and they happen to trust, Stephen, their buddy. And so we can do this. This can be done by better people than me and on a much larger scale. We just have to engage at that level and also not let the current situation turn into a reason for violence and hatred for another generation of Arab young.
From a biblical, historical, theological lens, Israel is a stiff-necked people, the Jews.
Yes.
There have been hardly any chapters where there was not war. The cycle of Judges, of course, there were periods of peace. When we let's turn the page on the Bible and come to the establishment of the United States of America out of a war, it just seems like your comment, and I've been saying this for 2 decades, we don't understand history, much less geopolitical history. There's never been a time of world peace. There's never been a time of unilateral, kumbaya around tea and baklava or coffee and donuts. It's the man's nature is depraved, selfish, money, sex, and power. And the hardwiring of this, we haven't even talked about the spiritual implications of what we're seeing in our tiny lifetime, which is why I always go back to 248 years. We're nothing. We're nothing on the scale of history. We're powerful. We're very successful. We're very wealthy. That's it. That's it. And we could fade just as quickly. Europe has 600-year-old chapels. We
Yes.
have what? Do we have any 200-year-old buildings still standing?
I don't think we do.
The White House crumbles every year. But you see where I'm going with this? It's like, is this just part of the God's sovereign, providential allowance of sin and hubris and I would be God, kings and Arabs and Jews? And then as the Christian, I hate the question, how do we respond? Because it seems like we can do something about it. And when Jake Sullivan says, this is what Israel should do about, well, who are you to tell them what they should do about it? So right. I get hackled about that. What's the Christian in his or her heart? How do they understand all this stuff? Just sorry for the prattle, but this geopolitical, historical situation. But yet we have a sovereign king. Christ is king. He's not wringing his hands, pacing heaven's floor, worried about what Netanyahu's doing or not doing.
Yeah. I think a Christian's got to hold 3 things in their hands at once. One is their theology of a sovereign God who governs history, who sets up kings, who determines the course of nations. So we recognize in humility that God's in charge and we are not. Number 2, we recognize, as you say, the sinful vileness of man, all of which play a role in human history. And I believe both of those keenly and pay attention to them. But the third thing a Christian's got to hold in their hand is to play their role, fulfill their destiny. I didn't come out of the womb thinking, hey, I think I'll sit with Arab leaders. I found myself with Arab leaders and said, hey, I've come here for such a time as this. I can maybe do a little good. Maybe I can move the ball down the field just a little bit. I'm no great shakes. So I think we have to not either despair or get lazy and say, God's got it. We've got to play our role. And you and I are both educators, well-educated educators, and we need to play our role if we're going to make a difference in this area. God put me in Nashville, Tennessee, a place I'd never been before I was 30 years old. And about 10 minutes after I showed up to serve at a church, Kurds began to pour into town. Well, I had a background in politics and history and a little bit of ability to communicate. And they like the fact that I'm 6'4" and 900 pounds. And so they...
you're losing weight, are you?
No, not even close. But the Kurds kind of like the fact that I'm bigger. And
yes.
so we laugh and we joke and we play. And I can eat more baklava and pistachio nuts than they can. And so we've developed a good friendship. And I realize, again, you constantly realizing I have a chance to do some good here. Those who are watching this who are great with video and tech, you got a chance to produce some video. You got a chance to open up new channels. I'm telling you, they're sitting over there watching YouTube. I get texts all the time, and also, emails and what have you, and notices online from people who have watched some new interview I've done on video on YouTube. Hey, Dr. Mansfield, we saw you, and they're watching this stuff. They may not even agree. You are wrong about Israel, but we love you. I hear this all the time, And I just say, yeah. And so let's talk more. If you would feed me more, I will talk to you more about Israel. This is the kind of tone we've got to play the role we can play. And so some are in politics, some are in public schools, some are in universities, some have tech abilities. Everybody's got an iPhone or whatever other version and can produce something where they're taking a stand. But this situation, I believe, is more malleable. I even like the fact that our hardcore Israel friends, our Israeli friends, are often called sabras. You've heard this before. It's from a version of cactus that's in Israel that's prickly on the outside and soft on the inside. And I'll sit there and have dinner with an Israeli friend in Jerusalem and have them go off about the Arabs they dislike. And then the doorbell rings, and the guy they work with shows up with baklava. I hear you have a guest. Why bring the baklava? They're hugging, they're hanging, and the guy walks out. I'm looking at my Israeli friend and said, I thought you were supposed to knife this guy when he walked in. You loved him, you welcomed him, he's putting food in your hands. So it's happening even though they talk a different game. I'm not saying that the animosity is false. I'm just saying that we Christians know that all these people are made in the image of God. They've got eternity in their hearts. They don't want to be living this way, not really. But yeah, there's real anger, real animosity. And I will tell you, frankly, just as a concession, I don't know that I will ever get back to any balance. The family I happen to know whose grandchild was thrown into an oven. I said it twice on this show. I won't say it again. But when that's happened to you, imagine I have young grandchildren, and I don't know that it would be hard for me to come back. And I'm a Christian who believes in the love of God. So yeah, we're not going to win everybody back, but I'm not sure we've really showed up for the game like we should.
Yeah, and some of those other atrocities that we won't talk about, inhumanity is an effective word to explain what happened to some of the young women in particular. It's beyond description. But
I believe the demonic was involved. I mean, not to make a big deal out of demons or demonology.
Well, it's evil. It's evil.
No
I mean,
question.
at the end of the day, so much of what we're looking at, even in our homeland, it's just evil. There's no
question.
explanation. And in my lifetime, Stephen, I don't think I've seen evil as unbridled and in our faces. Certainly in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Before there seemed to be a consciousness of good and morality, and there was a line that was drawn, and now it's out the window.
Yeah, I believe for those of us like you who watch university culture, who watch the underlying culture, not just the presentation on television, but the underlying culture. What are people really believing? What are their values really coming from? I'm not that surprised that an episode happened that pressed people to the edge of their genuine values and convictions. This has been simmering on the university campuses for years, and it just takes somebody to put the match to the fuel. The good news, though, again, I'm not trying to just be happy guy here. I'm on some of those college campuses. When I talk to some of the people who are angry protesters, their level of ignorance is stunning. They quickly get embarrassed about it. I send them to a few books, a few things to think about. I agree to meet them later if I can. And the turn happens quickly. So I don't mean to make light of it, but this is not hardcore, intellectually sound, rock, airtight arguments. This is emotion. This is emotion. In fact, I talked to some people who protested all day, and then at the end of the day, they proved to me they weren't sure what they were protesting. They were just with their friends. Now, that's not everybody. I'm aware of that. There are always the agitators and the intellectual leaders behind this thing, but this is tissue thin, and we can turn this thing. I believe it.
To illustrate that, I had a friend whose child was at Moody. And this was after I'd been there a number of years. And I was going back to Chicago to speak or something. And he wanted to have coffee. And I met this young man at a coffee shop. He wanted to meet far away from the Institute. And I thought, okay. And it's almost like this clandestine, let's meet somewhere in Arlington in the old Morrison house. And so we're sitting having coffee. And he says, do you know we have safe spaces on campus now? And I said, excuse me? And it was during the, Barack Obama and then later the BLM and these type of things. And I said, well, tell me about it. He goes, well, I went down because a lot of my friends were out there with bullhorns and yelling and screaming. And I went down and stood and I said, do you really not feel safe? And they got mad at me. And, I don't think he changed any opinions because he saw he was, quote, outnumbered and it wasn't a fight, but he was more curious. And I was just applauded him for having the courage to go down there and ask them, why don't you feel safe on the campus, for goodness gracious? But it illustrates your point that college students, and we were young once, What's the old line about if you're young and don't have what is it? I always fumble this one. If you're young, you don't have a heart, but if you're old, you don't have your head. What is it? You're a liberal
Well,
when you're young.
yeah, they used to say if you're a college student and you're not a liberal, you don't have a heart, and if you're an older person and aren't a conservative, you don't have a brain.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
so yeah, that's exactly right. The paraphrase of Churchill. But yeah, I think that's true. And by the way, we saw, not to say that the 1960s protesters, boomer generation didn't have some valid things to say, but a lot of that was about stir. A lot of that was about just anger and rebellion, and it dissipated relatively quickly. And these people became statistically majority conservative, and gave us a whole new business culture. So my point is not that the protests aren't valid. In fact, my father fought in Vietnam, and I'm a devoted supporter of the American military. But there were at least some questions that should have been asked about how that war was going on, and it's okay with me if the college age kids are asking those questions, as there should be questions of Israel now. But the point, nevertheless, is that often, if we won't just overreact and think these people are complete idiots and not engage them, we can often bring them back. It happened with the boomer generation. It could happen with the millennial and Gen Z.
Stephen Mansfield, I could talk to you all afternoon without pause, and I appreciate your work, your authorship, your mind, your kind-heartedness toward me, toward many people, and I pray God's great blessing on your work and your ministry.
Michael, I admire you deeply, buddy. Thanks for taking time to talk to me.